On page 171, Peterson begins a short digression where he considers the relation of belief in God or faith to the existence of God. This is a fascinating and revealing section. So on page 171, I'm going to read this because I want to put it in Peterson's own words. On page 171, he writes this. He says, modern people are obsessed with the idea of believing in quotations, God, as if that decision is one of positing or refusing to posit some material existence or absence thereof of some mere description, like the description of an object. God exists according to the implicit dictates of such a formulation in the same manner that a table exists, or in the manner that an imaginary table truly does not exist. A couple lines later, Peterson continues, to believe is much more truly and usefully to commit to sacrifice everything to be voluntarily possessed by. True belief is therefore the ultimate relationship, not the mere description of some state of affairs, end quote. Now, you might think that in what I just read, Peterson is merely making the point that belief in God is more than merely a kind of propositional attitude or the mere act of mental assent. And we can certainly agree that true belief involves more than merely affirming the proposition that God exists. As Peterson rightly sees, true belief involves action, right? Commitment, sacrifice. If we truly believe in something, we're going to act on it as the occasion arises. So true belief is not mere assent, but it involves active commitment, right? James tells us faith without works is dead. And this is a point that the Reformers emphasize when they distinguish between the terms assensus, which was a term that they used to describe just kind of mere belief in the existence of God, and then fiducia, which included assensus, but then went further. Fiducia was the placing of one's personal trust in and reliance upon God. Okay, but I would submit that Peterson is not simply making this familiar and useful point. He's saying something far more radical. And what he's really saying here is that belief in God just is commitment. Full stop. Existential commitment is, for Peterson, all there is to belief. And more specifically, he's saying that believing in God does not require and does not entail believing in the existence of God. This is the point that he's making in this passage. Now remember, Peterson has a functional understanding of God or the divine. We argued for this in the last time when we looked at chapter 2, I think. Peterson, or chapter 1, I'm sorry, the creation account. Peterson doesn't think of God in ontological or theological or even personal terms. God is not a transcendent being to be worshiped for Peterson. He's rather kind of a universally immanent process or force or spirit to be aligned with. And accordingly, the notions of belief and faith for Peterson are going to be cashed out in terms of alignment and commitment or possession. And the ontological question of God's existence, or what he calls material existence, just completely drops out of this picture, completely drops out of Peterson's understanding of faith. Now, this becomes clear when he considers the faith of Noah on page 172. He says, Noah's faith, therefore, faith is in quotation marks, is not the explicit statement of his belief in an imaginary being, as the follower or formulator of creeds might have it, but his identity with a certain spirit of conceptualization, apprehension, and forward movement. Does God exist for Noah? Does Noah believe? Here is the situation properly construed. God is for Noah, by definition, what guides him, what seizes him as he makes his way forward, no matter what he decides to do. So faith, for Peterson, does not entail belief in the existence of a transcendent God, because faith is the alignment of one's consciousness with an immanent mode of living. That's what faith is for Peterson. And in this sense, everybody has faith in God, right? Regardless of whether they actually believe that God exists or not. Insofar as everybody consciously chooses, commits to some mode of living or other. Now, you might be wondering, on Peterson's functional definition of faith, how is Noah's faith a faith in God, right? If faith doesn't require belief in God's existence, then in what sense is God even involved at all? Now, Peterson, interestingly, anticipates this objection, and he addresses it in the same passage. Now, it's kind of a clunky passage, so bear with me if I have to read it a couple times. So Peterson asks on page 172, why conceptualize this specifically as faith in God? Quotation marks. Because Noah must elevate something to the highest place, something that therefore is functionally equivalent to God, so that every other choice has been sacrificed and foregone. That which now guides established as fundamental or superordinate, and movement forward made possible. The fact that this uniting spirit is God, again in quotation marks, would remain true even if Noah explicitly disavowed any so-called religious belief. He goes on to say, Noah's belief in God, again, belief in quotation marks, Noah's belief in God is therefore not the formulaic recitation of an explicit proclamation of belief, although it could be that also, but his willingness to act when called on by the deepest inclinations of his soul. What you allow to move you, that is your belief in God, or in some second-rate substitute. This is a matter of definition. Not least within the story we are considering, the same applies in general to all stories currently under consideration. So again, Peterson is here explicitly separating and detaching faith from belief in the existence of God. For Peterson, one does not need to believe that God exists to have faith. We all have faith in God because we all commit ourselves to something which guides us. And that which guides us is our God, whether we believe that God exists or not. And this is a clear and deliberate departure, obviously, from the biblical and traditional Christian perspective. So last time we saw that Peterson functionalizes God. Here we see that the next logical move is to functionalize faith. And that's exactly what he does. And again, as I said last time, this is the reason why Peterson is so cagey when asked whether he believes in God. If you listen to his interviews, he's very cagey. He doesn't like the question. He doesn't like the question because it's put in ontological terms, right? Do you believe that God exists? His typical response is something like, it's more complicated than that, right? Or, I don't like the way that you frame the question. I went back and I listened to a recent interview that Peterson did with Piers Morgan, and Morgan tried to nail him down on the ontological question of God's existence. I think it was an interview from last year. And Peterson's response to Morgan was, if I'm going to answer that question, he said, I guess the correct answer is, by their works you shall know them. So what is he saying there? He's saying, if by believe in God you mean that I'm aligning my life with kind of an upward striving, and I'm committing to kind of this upward development of my psyche and my society, then in that sense, yeah, I do believe in God. Now, I do think that this is something of a struggle for Peterson, especially since his family has embraced more of a traditional Christianity. There are times where Peterson is on the edge. I've said this before, where it seems like he's going to tilt into kind of a traditional view of a transcendent personal God. He even tells Piers Morgan in that interview that he's afraid that God might actually exist. But at other times he tilts back into kind of just a straightforward pantheism. So anyway, I thought this section of chapter 4 is super, super revealing, and probably the most important section in this chapter in terms of just understanding the way Peterson approaches the biblical text, approaches the idea of God and the idea of faith.